Welcome to the Between Data and Risk podcast. Today we'll be talking about telecommunication infrastructure, which all modern businesses rely on, but most people rarely think about. To demystify this ubiquitous yet so important resource, we've invited Mike Gavin, former senior director who worked for such companies as Samsung and Verizon. Stay tuned.
If you're a business owner or senior manager, you probably had more than enough about all the wonderful opportunities awaiting you in the era of digitalization.
Whether it is big data, cloud, data science, or whatever buzzword is currently trendy.
If you would like to hear someone dissecting these claims and showing you what it actually takes to improve business processes, you're in the right place.
This is Between Data and Risk, where we discuss real-life examples of what works and what doesn't in the world of business operations.
Hi, I'm your friendly neighborhood data guy, Dr. Marian, and with me is my co-host, Artur Cognition Shared Solutions Chief Risk and Strategy Officer.
Hello.
Welcome to this episode of Between Data and Risk. Today we'll be talking about building the telecoms infrastructure of tomorrow to support the business solutions that will inevitably rely on it. We are excited to have with us our guest, Mike Gavin, an expert with over 30 years of experience in sales and operations for Verizon and Samsung. Hello, Mike.
Marian, Artur, it's great to be with you guys today. 30 decades, I don't know. I'd probably be a vampire if that was the case. But excited to be here with 3 decades.
So it's, really, you've seen the world change, working with Verizon and working with Samsung. I would like to start with maybe how do you see the difference between 3 decades ago and now, and how do you see the rate of change? I would say. Is it going as fast? Because recently we've been all told 5G is like the end of the line. It's like end of physics in early 20th century, before somebody came up with something completely different. 30 decades of experience. How do you how do you sum it up?
To put it in perspective, when I started with what was Bell Atlantic Mobile System 30 years ago, this March 1st. I started with an organization that had roughly 3,000 employees in total, and we had less than 1 million customers. So put that in perspective today to where we've ended up and how many different products, services, and how it's become the center of everyone's lives, whether you like that or not, right? Because there's people on both sides of the equation for that. The reality is, throughout that 30 years, there's been ebb and flow, right? So there's been these dramatic inclines where we've climbed and we've accomplished a great deal, and then it's flattened out. You think about 4G. We had 4G for a fairly long time without much transformation going on, and now all of a sudden we're at this cusp of 5G. And I say it that way because some people, there's a lot of marketing that goes around 5G, let's face facts, from all the providers around the globe. The reality is there's different variations of 5G that bring different levels of capability. But regardless of what variation you're discussing, the reality is that none of it is where it needs to be in order to really leap us into that next generation performance and bring in those apps and solutions that are going to once again change lives, much like the smartphone, much like the evolution from 3G to 4G, or when you think about 1G to 3G. Those leaps, we're not quite there yet with 5G. Great deal of promise, great deal of opportunity ahead, and all the carriers, providers, infrastructure, developers, they're all waiting with bated breath for that moment that we make that leap.
So I'm going to say something that really dates me. When I was at uni, we were still calculating kind of the frequencies on copper wires and 56K modems and that kind of thing. And at that time, when we kind of progressed to ADSL and the first generation of mobile phones, I had the impression that the technology was pushing the solutions. So every time there was a leap, people were saying, okay, now we can do this new thing, or we can do this new thing. But with 5G, I get a slightly different sense that the solutions are pulling the technology. People are now so hungry for bandwidth that we've got all these solutions. Metaverse. We had a few episodes on metaverse, and people just say we need this bandwidth, but it's just not there. Yeah. And it's this hunger that's created, right?
Well, I think you're spot on, Artur. The reality is, sometimes the developers are dragging the consumer and the businesses, and other times the push is the other way around. I think that the juncture that we're at right now is that we do have a mix. We have certain solutions that people crave and need, and I think that desire for the greatest speed, the greatest degree of bandwidth, right? That stability of performance is certainly great, regardless of whether you're looking from a business standpoint or a consumer standpoint. It doesn't matter. I believe that you find that desire is there. I think when you get into the weeds of some of the solutions that are out there, you think about, robotics, being able to have a dynamic manufacturing floor that you can change on the fly and not worry about any wires. Think about the beauty of that. And that exists today, right? But the idea of that operating on 5G consistently, having the level of SLAs that you need in order to feel comfortable that performance is guaranteed without issue. You think about, is anyone excited about remote surgery via, I mean, listen, I think it will be amazing when it comes about, but I am not signing up to be the first, right? I'm not ready for that, but that's me. I'm more cautious, right? So the reality is you have things at both ends of the spectrum, autonomous controls, whether it's machinery or vehicles, and the need to be able to have that constant compute and storage from a mobile edge compute solution. Today, there was an announcement by T-Mobile, a partnership with AWS. Now, roughly, I think almost 2 years ago, Verizon announced a similar partnership. We're seeing that crop up where carriers are now partnering with cloud solution providers to be able to bring compute and storage closest to applications. That is critical. None of this can really happen without that taking place, because that latency and the performance that exists within 5G is really, it's about the speed. Yes, it's about the total degree of bandwidth that can be handled. But if you don't have the low level of latency necessary for these applications, none of it will work right at the end of the day. And most of these applications are very, very much hinging on the latency requirements. And, you talk about, 5G and it's almost a holy grail of sorts, right? And certainly from a performance standpoint, that's the case where we're at today. But obviously 6G is out there, right? Not out there in the environment, but from a lab initial spec and ideation, it's certainly there. So we're always looking beyond. But who's driving? Is that the user or is that the developers? And I would argue in many cases it's being driven by obviously the developers, right? Give us more. Keep giving more.
I wanted to ask you. I know that in the States for a long time, pagers were much more popular than mobile phones. So we have this, I would say, step, which is if you start early enough, you will be stuck with the first version. I know that maybe if you say that 5G is still not that, does jumping on 5G will it hamper 6G when it comes? Because people will want to get ROI on all the 5G investment.
Yeah.
So how do you see the situation evolving? I'm not talking only about the States. I'm just
in general,
pagers,
right, sure.
But in general, like heavily investing in some technology. slows down if the 6G would just pop up
absolutely.
like tomorrow, a lot of companies would say, how about we make our money on 5G?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we saw it with 4G. So, Marian, you are incredibly on the mark when you talk about the investment concerns. The reality is the market, so the business customer that drives the solutions, they're not going to subscribe to 6G and until that point that they believe it's financially viable. But when you look at the infrastructure providers and the carriers in the marketplace, they're certainly going to push that because there's always that need to have the next greatest thing to differentiate between each other, to be able to drive new revenue streams. And certainly 6G is not coming tomorrow. Let's face it, we all know that. But the promise of 6G brings you into the realm of integrating networks into AI and being able to have a level of analysis and performance that we wouldn't see today. Now, also, there's great strides simulated on, certainly performance from a speed standpoint, but back to latency. The latency gains projected on 6G are quite incredible. We'll see, when that time is real. But for 5G today, we did see between 3G to 4G and now to 5G concerns, especially in the IoT space, because the cost of modules is incredibly relevant to the IoT space in that they can only upgrade the performance and capabilities of their devices if they can afford to put that new module in there. And the margins on some of these applications solutions, I mean, there's not a lot of room in many cases. And obviously that varies. There are some more robust than others. But when you look at the bulk of them, there's really not that room to make that upgrade, to make that truck roll, to switch out a modem until it absolutely makes sense to do it, right? And that has been that struggle. We've seen that with the shutdown of 3G to move all into 4G in the IoT space. So that has hindered that.
And there's, at the risk of getting slightly too technical, there is also the energy requirements, right? Which is why most IoT, if it's on Wi-Fi, it's still on the slower version of Wi-Fi because the energy requirements are higher. So there are all those concerns. But I wanted to touch on something you said about latency, because I think we need to differentiate between businesses that require or implementations that require that specific speed and kind of connectivity across the globe. Like you mentioned, remote surgery, right? You've got one surgeon, you've got one patient, and they need to be connected through all the links. But there are others, like you mentioned, cloud providers, where the technology exists to replicate the service in many locations in the world so that the user reaches the closest, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it was 10 years ago, it was completely incomprehensible. Nowadays, even last week, we were setting up a server where we chose several different locations to have it, and it cost us really peanuts to have it. So it was, nowadays, it's kind of common practice. So do you think, I'm very interested in this partnership between network carriers and providers. Aren't they a bit competing? Isn't there a bit of conflict interest because they ultimately, the carriers want to provide the network, the cloud providers want to provide services across the globe, and that's there. How do they justify this connection?
Yeah, so that's the frenemy environment, right? So
yes,
we need to work together. We understand we need that. We sort of want it. Sometimes maybe we want it because we know we have to do it, not because we really want to. The reality is either one of them can perform the full service, right? If they chose to, but that takes investment, right? So the idea of a hyperscaler possibly getting into the, a wireless or a network infrastructure space. I mean, certainly it's in the realm of possibility. Whether that would ever happen, it's unclear. But the reality is there's a need for each other, for these solutions to be effective, to be able to operate in the degree that they need to, whether in a domestic area or around the globe. Those partnerships are necessary. None of this can happen without them. And when I say none of this, these are the more complex solutions. These are the autonomous, the remote control of machinery, the remote surgeries, and various different immersive experiences that might exist on the consumer side, whether gaming oriented or in-venue solutions during games and events, or various, different elements of what might be the metaverse, right? You're going to require, obviously, a wireless connectivity. You're going to need extensive backhaul on fiber throughout to feed that network. And you're going to need to put, possibly both compute and storage closer to the user, right? So they're necessary without question. But it is a frenemy environment that exists. So there's friction there, whether anybody really wants to admit it. I hope that answers your question.
It answers perfectly, and it actually links very nicely to the kind of topic which is very close to the core of our podcast, which is processes. Yeah. Because now you're building this layer infrastructure of you've got carrier, you've got the service provider, you've got the in between, you've got the cloud kind of infrastructure provider, you've got the user. So we're building the traditional kind of layers of abstraction, and they have to work together. So you've got diverse technologies, diverse partners, and I understand one of your kind of roles was to make this basically work together and operate seamlessly. So what state are we in currently in this market, and how do you actually make them operate together towards servicing the user ultimately?
Yeah, so we're certainly in the earlier stages of this, because from an operating model perspective, these partnerships, and as I mentioned, T-Mobile made an announcement today. The reality is they're still at the early stages of developing these partnerships. Even though Verizon might be a bit further along with those partnerships, the fruit of that labor is still early on. So the development of how they will work together, and then the installation of those solutions into the network, and actually, having them exist on any sort of wide scale, very much in the early stages. And there's a great deal of politics that exists within this environment. Once again, it's one of those things that we won't talk a lot about oftentimes, because we just want it to work and we just expect it to work. But what goes behind the scenes in order to establish the agreements and the relationships between all these entities to ensure that the level of risk from each one of their perspectives is minimized and reduced. It's not eliminated, right? There's always that risk, right? And some of that comes back to that frenemy comment that I made. So there's always a little apprehension, as much as there might be documents that outline what each one will bring to the table, what they will live up to from an SLA perspective, performance perspective, and what they'll add into that solution. Now, there's one group that you didn't mention, which I think is very key, especially when you talk about mobile edge compute, and that's the real estate holders associated with the cell towers and the base station. So if you think about all the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands around the globe of cell towers and their associated base stations, whether a macro tower or whether a small cell on a street light, whatever that may be, that's not the carrier at the end of the day. And that's not AWS, and the cloud providers. And that's certainly not the infrastructure provider, right? That's a separate entity in the real estate market that's associated. And you've got environments where carriers are stacked on these towers, or light poles in some cases, mostly the towers. And those real estate companies, well, they have very valuable real estate, especially when you think about the mobile edge compute environment. What storage or real estate facility is closest to everyone as we sit here today? Well, it's a cell tower. You know, in the back in the day, it would have been a central office, and that wouldn't have been that close, but it might have been nearby. But in those cell towers, there's each base station, and those base stations, they've got room. There is room in those base stations.
You said something very interesting. I've never thought about it this way, because I come from a financial background, and Michael Lewis, the famous author, he wrote the book Flash Boys, specifically about banks, firms, trading firms going to financial exchanges and placing their computers, those kind of a few meters of the cable closer to the exchange so they could trade faster. Now you're saying this is exactly happening in the mobile industry. I've never thought about this way.
There's and I won't say what platform has it, but there's a platform with a true story about just that, about someone that moved closer and came up with a creative way to have a direct connectivity into the trading floor faster than anyone else. You may be familiar with that story. Yes, this is a similar scenario in a way. I would say on a very much a hyper scaled scenario, because you're talking about, think of the cell towers as all endpoints, right? And every one of those endpoints has a box at the bottom. And that box, as of today, isn't filled. I mean, it has equipment, it has servers in it to be able to run the wireless networks. But the reality is, that's beachfront property in a way when you talk about mobile edge compute. You think about the ability to get close to users. You think about that broad, wide, extensive network that exists of various different forms of cell sites.
I'm curious about something that you said earlier. It's a bit different topic. You mentioned the backhaul on the fiber. Do you think we will be, let's say, connected to the fiber? Like, is fiber to stay?
Well, I'm not aware of anything that will replace it yet, right? And we know it, while it doesn't operate at the speed of light exactly, but it's gotten as close to the speed of light as can, right? As humanly can today. And when you think about the ability to the size of those cables today and how much data can transfer on those, I mean, it's quite remarkable. The level of builds going on around the US right now by a variety of different carriers and suppliers of dark fiber, it's pretty extensive. I mean, at one point, and I can't say, I don't know exactly where it's at today, but at one point it was pushing the limits of the manufacturers of fiber. I mean, it was pushing the limits of the demand for fiber, to replace existing copper still at different parts of the country. Obviously, copper still across large swaths of areas. Not as much in certain areas, but the reality is that's an extensive project.
I moved from UK almost a year ago, 1st of March. And when I was moving out, and I lived like 15 miles from London, and I had a copper wire.
Yeah.
Well, I still live in UK, and UK is suffering exactly from the lag that Marian mentioned in the beginning, because UK invested heavily in broadband at the beginning. But now the broadband, everyone has broadband. It's very prevalent, but it's the old, they call it high-speed broadband, but it's like 5 megabits, right? Nothing by today's standards. And my road is going to be literally closed for the next 2 weeks because they're digging up the copper wire to replace it with fiber. But now thinking about this, going from you've seen all those quantum leaps in technology, and obviously they all start as a proof of concept in a lab somewhere. Some bright spark comes up with a better way of sending the signal, and then it goes to wide scale adoption through various stages, and users rarely see this process. But I think we've spoken about all the different forces that kind of make it either push it or they pull it. But how do you see this process actually happening? What will the next big technology of tomorrow, what will it have to go through, assuming that it's on a lab bench somewhere today?
Yeah. Well, obviously that through the ideation that exists within all of these infrastructure providers, partnering with developers to understand, can this be profitable at the end of the day, right? There's that level of work that goes on. Various different organizations have their locations around the globe where ideation takes place with a developer environment. From a standards perspective, we can look back at the various back and forth that went on for 5G for some time. And I don't remember the entire timeline that was associated with that, but landing on an agreed to 5G standard. And I'm not sure that there was, ultimately, I think there may be still some fractions of that exist, particularly from a marketing standpoint, for sure. And the reality is that debate can go on for a long time until people stop bothering with it, right? I think, when we talked about 5G before, I think we're a long ways away from a movement from 5 to 6G. And is that a decade? Could that be longer than that? It's my perspective that if we are to go to that next evolution from 5 to 6, I think it's got to be a time when 4G is kind of at its end, so to speak, in all likelihood, because there's heavy investment in 4G across the IoT. And I think that makes it difficult for 6G to come about because, everybody's got to move along. Networks cannot maintain too many different networks within them, right? So the idea of, it is not an ideal scenario to operate 3G, 4G, and 5G at the same time. And that's gone on. And that is incredibly inefficient, it's costly to the carriers. And it's not the ideal situation you want to be in. So for that reason, I think you're more than a decade away from another evolution because 4G will need to be in place for at least the next 10 years, for sure, because the level of commitment necessary back to the IoT space that network will be maintained is key. And that's a fact.
I'm thinking about the evolution of PC processors. And I remember, we went through from 8086 to 80 to 286, 386. But when we were already at Pentium and the whole world was on Pentium, 8086 was still being produced. All the other ones between were stopped being produced. Yeah. But 8086 was used by NASA, and that was still being produced. So is it possible that we will have 4G for quite a while longer, while 5G is switched off in favor of 6 and 7G, but 4G specifically as a legacy for IoT because of the lower energy requirements and the ease of use of it?
I mean, I certainly see where you're coming from. I think the challenge is migrating isn't easy. So carriers, infrastructure providers, to liken to processor orientation. Listen, manufacturers will make whatever you ask them to at the end of the day when pushed. I mean, certain things they may not want to, right? If it requires retooling a manufacturing line unnecessarily or inconveniently. But the reality is, if you'll pay for it, they'll produce it, right? At the end of the day. Now, from a service provider standpoint, the reality is you have a volume of users and they have a device today. Migrating them to a device with that new chipset in it, it's hard. It's hard, and it really depends. Switching out a smartphone can happen organically, right, over time, right? I mean, we've gotten into this phase where you lease devices, and it's you're just always paying a fee for a device. So what's the difference? I get a new device. So switching out every year, every 2 years, it's become fairly easy for people to do that. But when you get away from the smartphone environment, it's not so easy. So in those instances where maybe an IoT solution is on 5G, or possibly fixed wireless access, right? If you think about FWA, I just paid to light up my whole industrial facility with 5G. I need to make sure that investment covers itself. So the idea of going to 6G, because, are you shutting off 5G, which is in and of itself, the idea of just shutting something off, people get anxiety. And it becomes very difficult to make that cut and that move. And I'll point to 3G for that. That has been a painful process for the carriers.
I'm curious because now we touched on the risks of, let's say, getting attached to a technology and the risk that somebody will shut it off. You mentioned that when you get this network of providers, real estate owners, cloud computing providers, they weigh their risks. Are you at liberty to say, or what are the main risks for each of these categories? Our podcast is called Between Data and Risk, and we are really interested in what are the actual risks for different businesses.
Yeah. I can't say that I know necessarily what the risk is for a cloud provider or in the real estate space. Mm-hmm. I would think in the real estate space, I think the risk is probably minimal. They're just maintaining a property, they're maintaining a network. Changes in technology, I don't think really present a significant risk, and maybe I just don't know what that is. From a infrastructure provider perspective, they obviously always need to be on the cutting edge. So I'd say their risk is, being asked for something they can't provide at the end of the day. So they've got to be ready for when that, if we take the 6G scenario, they've got to be ready for when that market demands it, right? Mm-hmm. So they need to invest in R&D today and mm-hmm. scope out what it's capable of, what really can be done, right? They'll figure out in the lab, but then in the real environment, what's truly possible, and then establishing those standards across the partnerships that exist. They've got to do all that work. They have to do it now, and there's a risk of not doing it because you don't want your competitor to be further along than you are. And there are competitors, there's enough of them, in this environment that it poses a challenge, right? From a carrier perspective, I think, it's a similar scenario to the infrastructure. There's that competitive environment. That risk is being beat out by your competitor. Some of that is often mitigated through marketing at the consumer level and even at the business level. But, sometimes the business customer is a bit more savvy. And they, they want to know what it's really capable of. Mm-hmm. And they want to ensure that it's going to live up to their requirements. And I think about carriers, and everyone plays in this space as a carrier, infrastructure provider, ultimately in a mobile edge compute environment, it's a cloud provider. Being able to provide network slicing, being able to provide a solution that meets the specific needs of your application, nothing more, nothing less, and only paying for that portion. Not overpaying, obviously not underpaying, but not overpaying for what you need to be able to adequately run your application, your solution for your clients. If you can't do that, then ultimately, many of these solutions can't truly come to life. So, everyone's at a different point of being able to provide that capability, right? So that's that competitive environment. I think there's an added challenge that is probably more on the side of the carriers versus the cloud providers. And that is the competitive, or excuse me, the frenemy competitive element that exists between them, right? So that apprehension of, I'm going to partner with you. You're going to know who my clients are. I'm going to know the clients that you're working with, at least when I come into the picture. And we're going to have a relationship with that client side by side. The fear or concern of could that cloud provider at some point decide, you know what, I'd like to have a network of my own. Or maybe I'd like to be an MVNO, and I'll flip a switch and I'm instantly an MVNO. And the implications of that, I think that's a concern, right? So that's now a new competitor, right? So the risk is you partner, right? And then your partner becomes your competitor. It may not happen, but it could happen. That's the challenge. That's the risk.
Sorry, you mentioned a term which we're not quite familiar with, MVNO.
Mobile virtual network operator.
I see, MVNO. Okay.
Oh, did I miss-say it? I might have said it.
No, that clarifies it. So these are the kind of risks from the perspective of the infrastructure provider, obviously the cloud provider. But what about how involved are these providers in the risks faced by the business, by the client? I'm thinking specifically here about business clients, because I can think of several. We would be completely amiss if we didn't mention cybersecurity, but that's one which is quite loudly spoken about, but it's not the only one. There's also kind of the risk of relying too much on a single provider, the concentration risk, I would call it. There is kind of the technology obsolescence risk, which obviously we know it's pretty low now that we've got 5G and it's here to stay for some time, but it is there. So all these business clients, they have to think about putting all their kind of eggs in one basket and building up what is usually quite expensive investment in their use of the infrastructure. So are these you've worked with Verizon and Samsung? Are these companies actually involved in trying to mitigate these risks, or are they left solely to the client to kind of work around?
Yeah. So the reality is, a lot of this also orients to the application itself as well. So if you look at it from the IoT perspective, it's not uncommon for an IoT solution to have more than one module. It really depends on the type of IoT solution, but it's not uncommon to have two carriers or two network providers embedded within your solution. So you've got a primary and a secondary. It's particularly evident in solutions that move, that are not stationary, because the quality of service can change within different geographies. When you look at maybe a more basic solution, you think about your smartphones, your tablets, your embedded devices, your jetpacks, that sort of thing, your fixed wireless routers, things along those lines. Oftentimes clients, and I won't mention any clients by name, but some of the biggest players that sit in the globe oftentimes will divide up their risk, right? So they may give, split in half. There have been times when there are some that have split three ways, so that they've essentially mitigated their experience across maybe three providers, two providers, whether they do that equally, whether they do that as a first and a secondary, meaning there's going to be a primary that has the bulk and then a secondary, and how they go about doing that, whether they do it mathematically and just, you get what you get and we've mitigated a risk, or they give choice. to their user community, and they let the user community decide. And with certain types of products, like a smartphone, that's very common for that to take place through a primary and a secondary provider. But we'll oftentimes maybe push people in a certain direction based on the offer that they've got from that network provider, and one may be more attractive than the other. They may find that wherever they exist as an organization, the performance with a given network provider might be better than another, and that's kind of where the sales element comes in, right? It's selling what makes you the best and better than your competitor to be able to woo that client more to you versus another. And so I would say, the client mitigates the risk. They decide what's relevant to them, and the network provider does what they need to do in order to try to win the majority of what might be out there, both on current base as well as future opportunities. I think I think about a variety of different scenarios I've been across my career where I've seen it every which way. And I've even seen clients in particular industries, and this has been most prevalent in finance, where they've mitigated down to the contract, meaning they won't take liability, they'll leave liability in the user, in the employee, so that they're not contractually bound. But they will wield their negotiation power to get the best possible deal that they can. And would you expect anything less from the finance? Let's be real. Get the best of all worlds, right? Of course they should. They're expert negotiators in the finance. And so there's different things that exist in the environment that cause variety of different scenarios, how they mitigate that risk.
So it looks like we have kind of all the people who are thinking about the solutions of tomorrow and are thinking about metaverses and getting everyone connected and doing devising all those apps that take over our lives. Yeah. They have to rely ultimately on someone providing that transceiver, that fiber, that copper cable or carrier pigeon that will send that data from A to B. And very often these days, it's absolutely forgotten. And as we see, there's quite a lot of challenge going into all this, and quite a lot of progression, quite a lot of forces planning, which I think, I hope that especially to the business users who rely on all this infrastructure, and they have their clients to think about, they have their business to think about, and they have their risk to think about. That will bring it kind of closer to them, to the reality of what it actually means to send that package of information from your server to your mobile phone. I think it was absolutely enlightening. If people want to find out more about these concepts, where can they contact you somehow? Where would you recommend them to go to basically learn more?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so Mike Gavin. You can find me. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone that's interested in discussing anything further.
Thank you very much.
Great. I think it was very interesting. At least it was for me. And as usual, let's hope it was of use to someone. Thank you for listening.
Also, don't miss the next one, where we'll be talking about energy from photovoltaics with our guest, Jeff Ellis, Director of Operations at Sunnova New Homes, who will describe to us the technology, the operations behind installing it, the economics of it, and the current and future trends.
Subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or visit bdr.show to find out more about future episodes and guests. You can also check out cognition.llc for more information on Cognition Shared Solutions, our services, and other events hosted by us.
For now, it's thank you from myself, your friendly neighborhood data guy, Dr. Marian, and my co-host, Artur.
Thank you.